We are at Westminster Abbey, which is one of the most iconic spots in London. Here happened all English and British coronations, as well as have here the royal tombs.
To be honest, before visiting Westminster Abbey, I thought the tombs would be limited to a few famous names, like Elizabeth I and Mary Queen of Scots. What I didn't realize is that burial monuments are woven throughout the entire church. For centuries, being buried in Westminster Abbey was considered one of the greatest honors in Britain, and as a result, the church gradually became the final resting place of monarchs, nobles, military leaders, politicians, scientists, writers, and poets. Stepping into Westminster Abbey, I expected to be looking for famous names. Instead, the first few minutes are spent simply taking in the building itself. The Gothic architecture is enormous, with centuries of stonework stretching in every direction. Along the way, you pass tombs and monuments belonging to people you've probably never heard of, and somehow that makes the abbey feel even older. Long before you reach the famous tombs or coronation site, you're reminded that Westminster Abbey wasn't built around a handful of historical figures. It has been accumulating history for centuries. The church you see today was largely rebuilt by Henry III in 13th century in the Gothic style that was spreading across Europe from France. For medieval worshippers, this wasn't just architecture, it was intended to create the feeling of stepping into a heavenly space. Just before reaching the choir lies the tomb of Newton, one of the most influential scientists in history. He was buried in 1727 in an area of the nave known as Scientist's Corner. Ahead lies the choir, one of the most recognizable parts of Westminster Abbey. Even if you've never visited before, chances are you've seen it. For centuries, this part of the abbey has provided the backdrop for some of Britain's most important moments: royal weddings, coronations, and state funerals. For centuries, monarchs have passed through here on their way to the coronation ceremony, and when the next great royal event takes place, chances are the world's cameras will be pointed right back at this space. And then you arrive at the part of Westminster Abbey that has witnessed more turning points in British history than perhaps any other. The High Altar. At first, it doesn't feel dramatically different from the rest of the church. There is nothing announcing that you've reached one of the most important ceremonial spaces in the country. But this is where monarchs have come for centuries at the beginning of their reigns. Henry VIII would have stood here, Elizabeth I stood here, Queen Victoria, Elizabeth II, and most recently Charles III. What struck me is how little the scene has changed. The people are different, the centuries are different, yet the same church, the same altar, and the same pavement continue to play their role in one generation after another. As I continue through the abbey, I passed countless tombs and monuments. What surprised me wasn't just the number of them, but their scale and craftsmanship. Some are so elaborate that they feel more like works of art than burial monuments. Every monument seems to belong to a different period and tell a different story. I found myself stopping far more often than I expected, because the craftsmanship was so impressive. When you reach the shrine of Edward the Confessor, you realize it all started with one man. Edward was the king who founded the original Westminster Abbey and was later declared a saint. For centuries, his shrine attracted pilgrims from across England. In fact, many of the kings and queens chose to be buried nearby because of their connection to Edward. The abbey also has a lot of smaller spaces, like this chapel. The level of detail is still impressive. This is the tomb of Eleanor of Castile, one of the most important queens of medieval England. And this is the tomb of Henry III. In 1245, he began rebuilding Westminster Abbey in the Gothic style. So a lot of what makes the Abbey feel so impressive today can be traced back to one king's ambition nearly 8 centuries ago. Before reaching other famous names, I found myself stopping to admire some of the older monuments along the way. The detail in the stone carving, the scale, and the variety of styles make this part of the Abbey particularly fascinating. And that's one of the things I enjoyed most about Westminster Abbey. Some of the most memorable discoveries were the ones I wasn't expecting to find. One of the tombs I was most looking forward to seeing was Elizabeth I. She ruled England for 44 years and remains one of the country's most famous monarchs. What surprised me though is that she isn't buried alone. The tomb is shared with her half-sister, Mary I. The two women had a complicated relationship. Mary imprisoned Elizabeth during her reign, and they represented very different visions for England's future. Yet today they rest together in the same tomb. Now we are approaching the tomb of Mary, Queen of Scots. Her life reads almost like a historical drama. She became Queen of Scotland as an infant, spent part of her childhood in the French court, lost her throne, fled to England, and ultimately spent nearly 19 years in captivity before being executed in 1587. What makes this monument especially remarkable is that it was commissioned by her son, James I. After Elizabeth I died without children, James inherited the English throne and ordered a magnificent tomb to be built for his mother in Westminster Abbey. It's one of the grandest royal monuments in the church, and a reminder that despite her tragic fate, Mary's son ultimately succeeded where she could not, becoming king of both England and Scotland. One of the things I was most curious to see was the Coronation Chair. After hearing about it for years, I expected something much grander. Instead, what stands in front of you is a surprisingly simple wooden chair. And yet, standing in front of it, you realize this may be one of the most important pieces of furniture in the world. Generation after generation of monarchs sat in this exact chair before beginning their reigns. The cloisters are one of the last parts of Westminster Abbey you'll see before leaving. If you're coming to London, the Abbey is one of those places I genuinely put near the top of the list. I expected royal history. What I didn't expect was how much there was to see beyond the famous names. There were so many stories I didn't have time to follow. By the time I left, I wasn't really finished with Westminster Abbey. I was already thinking about what I'd come back to see on my next visit.